Three, two, and welcome back to Mr. Valle's class. This is U.S. History here at Sanchez North. Wolves, I hope you had a great weekend, one where you got to rest. We're back now, so let's get to it. Today in U.S. History, we are going to take a look at the years before the United States became the United States. We're going to be talking about the age of exploration, so we're going to rewind about 200 years. Back in the day, in the third grade, you probably learned the rhyme. In the year 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And even though that's the first explorer we were probably introduced to, he really wasn't the first European explorer. By the time Columbus came around, Europe had been exploring different parts of the world for about 100 years, maybe a little less. But we're going to learn more about that. So let's get to it. Now, we have to think about exploration in this way. During this time, it was not a very peaceful time in Europe. In Europe, you had small kings that would like to fight one another so they could go ahead and conquer each other's castles and steal each other's wealth and steal each other's land. So we have to ask ourselves, why then would these kings risk their gold, risk their lands, risk their lives to go explore parts of the world that was far away? It would probably make more sense for these kings to stay home and protect the land that they had rather than just to leave and risk losing it all. So let's get to it. Let's see why. In order to understand this, though, we have to rewind the clock about 1500 years ago, 1500 years ago. And we have to look at when Europe stopped being part of the Roman Empire, and we have to take a look at when Europe was really just a bunch of little villages being ruled by kings over these villages. Now, at this time, most of the people were farmers. Yeah, you had some kings and queens, like in the fairy tales. You had some knights, without a doubt. But most of the time, if you were living in that age, you would probably be a farmer. Now, farming back then was really difficult. It's hard now. If you have family members who are farmers here or somewhere else, um, you know that it's really hard. I have family members in Mexico who actually farm corn in the middle of the mountains in the state of Guerrero, and I can tell you, they are some of the hardest working people I know. Well, it was even harder back then because they didn't have the same kind of technology that we have now. And because they didn't have that same kind of technology, you would you would need lots and lots and lots of people to farm to get a limited amount of food. Well, in this picture, the big one that you see on the bottom, you see some changes that are happening around the High Middle Ages. About the year about 1000, you see that they're beginning to introduce some technology. What do I mean by technology? Well, we don't see them with laptops or with an iPad. Technology just means anything created by humans, an invention that helps you accomplish a goal. So if we take a look at this image, we see something with wheels and something that's digging into the ground. It's called a plow. Because of technological advancements like the plow, people weren't as needed on the farms as they were before. They were able to do different things. In this picture, I want you to focus way off in the distance. Way off in the distance, you're going to see two buildings. These two buildings, one building on the left is a windmill. What's happening there is people are probably taking their grain to be ground. What happens in the windmill with that grain is they grind it up and it becomes flour, and that flour then becomes bread. This is the time in history where most people ate bread as their main source of food. Well, the other building that you see back there is a castle, and that castle is full of people that are no longer needed to farm. What kind of jobs do these people have? Well, they're more knights, let's say. They're knights that are willing to fight for their king, but they really don't know how to do much else other than fight. Who else is there? Well, you have merchants or traders that come from faraway lands, and they come from those faraway lands with lots of stories. Stories of the East, stories of faraway places that need to be reconquered or taken back from other people that moved in. Specifically, we're talking about the Holy Lands. Lots of times, kings would sit around with their knights and they would be looking for a fight. And they were tired of fighting each other, so they decided that it might be a good idea to go off to the east, to Jerusalem, to the Middle East, and fight against the Muslims that had conquered these holy lands. These were called the Crusades. The Crusades were an opportunity for the European knights to get up and do something, and they did. They traveled from all over Europe. They went to the Middle East. They went to Jerusalem, to Beirut, to Tripoli. These are different cities in the Middle East. And they would fight against the people that were living there because they wanted to claim the lands of the Bible as free from non-Christians. Well, when they were there, they noticed something. They noticed the clothes that other people had. They noticed their shoes. They noticed their tabletops, what they ate, and the perfumes that they wore. And they realized that everything that they were wearing, eating, or using was a little different and new and unique to the people from back home. And they realized that if they could take these products back home, they would probably make a little bit of money. This is the beginning of the Silk Road. Now, if you take a look at this map, you're going to see some of these trade routes. Each color on this map represents a family or a group of families that were in charge of that specific chunk of the route. Along these routes is where money would go in one direction, and the spices, the silks, and the ideas would go in the other. If your family was the owner or the administrator of one of these routes, you're coming from a very rich family. If your family wasn't involved with that, well, one of your elders was probably looking for a way to be a part of one of these families that controlled these different routes. But it was very hard to get into that business. It makes sense. You really don't want to add more and more people into the business because then you get less and less money. We'll come back to that later. So now we were talking just a couple of seconds ago about the food, the spices, the silks that come and go along that trade route. But that's not the only thing. Things that you can touch or wear or eat are not the only things that came and went with the traders. Ideas also came and went. And some of the ideas that the traders brought from the East were things like musical instruments or scientific discoveries. And, I'm going to tell you guys something that you might not understand, and that's okay. We'll come back to it. But in this age of social media, of iPads, of iPhones, of being able to transmit your ideas through voice, through a video, to all of your friends on social media, that's so normal to us that we can't imagine just how amazing it was for ideas to be transported in a way that we think is very old school, and it wouldn't really get us as excited as it got them at all. What do I mean? Well, I'm talking about what you see on the left-hand side. That picture, that drawing, is of a printing press. And even though the printing press can only make books for the people of the Renaissance is very much like TikTok or Instagram of today. That was the way they could get ideas far from where the ideas were born and into the hands of people who would be inspired by these ideas to have even more ideas, to create more things. And one of these things that was created, or many of the things that were created, were these different tools that the Europeans would later use to go across the oceans. Now, not only were the tools themselves getting better, more complex, and allowing them to travel further away into the middle of the ocean, but the ships themselves were becoming more complicated, sturdier. Not only could they now carry people, but they could also carry lots of supplies. This ship that you see here, a carrack, this ship was a combination of different styles of ships that are found in Europe and Asia, and some even say that there's some Chinese influence. Well, that'd be really interesting if that's true. More on that later. Now, at this time, the thinking that Europeans had on how to make money was this idea called mercantilism. Mercantilism is this theory of economics, which, in short, or at its most basic level, means that you want to get as much gold and silver into your country by selling the most things. So you really don't want to buy lots of things from other countries, because if you buy lots of products from other countries, you're giving up your gold and your silver to pay for it. But you do want other countries to use their gold and silver to buy your products. Mercantilism is one of the reasons why the trade routes in the East were so popular. But they realized that the more that they purchased things from the East, the less gold and silver they would have. So what I mean is, if you lived in Europe and you see Europe on the left-hand side, and you're a king who has a room full of gold, well, the only thing you could do with that gold at this time, according to mercantilism, is to go ahead and give this gold to China, to India. In exchange, you would get silk, you would get the spices, you would get the new inventions. And so there was this idea that you really didn't want to do that. What you might want to do instead is maybe you yourself, or a representative, go to these places to see if you can work out a deal and cut out the middlemen, cut out the people in the middle that would take some of your gold and silver. You'd want to go ahead and go yourself so you can keep a little bit more of it. Oops. Sorry about that, guys. So, let's continue. So, one of the three things that we need to take a look at is the three reasons why people would explore. We summarized it with the three G's. You probably learned this in Texas history last year. Glory, gold, and God. Let's take a look at one at a time. Glory. Well, that's pretty self-explanatory. People like to be famous. People like for other people to recognize their accomplishments. And to this day, we're still talking about the people who explored, like Columbus, like Cortez. So yeah, glory. They achieved glory. Let's move on to the second one, gold. Well, there's really not a lot of explanation that we need for gold. Gold is gold. Everybody wants gold. Everybody wants to be rich. The last reason why people wanted, or why Europeans wanted to explore the world, I should say, is because they wanted to go and spread the word of God. Now, it's not just the people who were conquering that wanted to spread the word of God, but the kings felt that they received their power directly from God. It's this idea called divine right. Kings in Europe at the time believed that God chose them to be king or queen, and because of that, the king owed God a little bit of loyalty, or a lot of loyalty, and would go out of their way to prove their loyalty to God. So if they would go ahead and allow an explorer to represent them in faraway lands while they were conquering, one of the stipulations, one of the conditions was that this person needed to try to take holy people with them so that they could talk to the people who lived there already in these new lands and try to convert them. More on that later. It's a little more complicated than that. Now, I told you earlier that Christopher Columbus was not the very first explorer. Well, most of the time we understand that Prince Henry is the one who started exploring at this time for Europe. There were other explorers, sure, but in this age around the 1400s that we call the Age of Exploration, well, it was started by Prince Henry. Why? Well, he was from Portugal. And if you take a look at Portugal, Portugal is that little spot of green north of Africa on the tip of Europe. They really didn't have much access to those other routes. Remember we talked about families owning different routes and being able to or not being able to be a part of it? Well, because they're so far off towards the west, so close to the coast, there was no way for them to go east without bumping into people who already had established routes. So King Henry said, all right, we're off in the west, so we're really up against mountains and ocean. We can't go over the mountains. Let's go to the ocean. Let's see if we can find a way to get to these far off cities so that we can go ahead and get a new route. They had been trying that for years. And finally, after about 50 years, they managed to go around Africa towards India and even China. And even though it did take a lot of time, because there were no middlemen, because this was a brand new route, Prince Henry and Portugal became one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. So it was a success. It was good for them to have done that because Portugal became really wealthy. Well, countries in Europe are sometimes like bad friends nowadays. A good friend will be happy if you do well. If you win the lottery, they'll be happy for you. A bad friend may not be happy and they might get a little jealous if you happen to win the lottery, for example. And the same thing happens with the European powers during the Age of Exploration. If Portugal started getting wealthy, well, its closest neighbor, Spain, got a little jealous. And they also wanted to see if they could find the same route or another route so they could be just as wealthy. This is where Ferdinand and Isabella and Christopher Columbus comes in. They come in into the story because they wanted Christopher Columbus not to go find a new continent. They wanted Christopher Columbus to find another route that was similar to Portugal's. They couldn't go around Africa like on this side because that route was owned already by Portugal. So Spain, his next door neighbor, or Portugal's next door neighbor, they wanted to find another route, an ocean route, to get to India. So we know that he sailed in 1492 in 3 ships, and he did land on October 12th. And you know the story where he thought he was in India, but he really wasn't. And again, he wasn't the first one to explore different lands. He wasn't the first European to find the Americas. In the 11th century, a full 300 years earlier, Leif Erikson had gone from Iceland to Greenland, and they went ahead and landed on northern Canada. To this day, there's this legend that the Native Americans of that area are not only tall, but some of them have blue eyes. And they say that it's probably because Leif Erikson, a Viking, Vikings with light colored eyes and light colored skin, very tall, were lost there, probably intermarried almost 1,000 years ago. We don't know if it's true or not, or if that's the reason why. But it is true that we have found artifacts. We have found ships and tools that are definitely Viking in Canada, so up north, that really shouldn't be there unless the Vikings did come. So Christopher Columbus was not the only one to have come so soon to the Americas. The Vikings had, and obviously the Native Americans were already there. The Native Americans discovered America even before the Vikings did. But he went ahead and did a few more journeys back and forth, and by the third journey, he realized that it was the Americas, that it wasn't another route to India. Now, Amerigo Vespucci is the one who was the first map maker to realize this and to start really hyping up this idea that it wasn't India, but it was instead a different continent, and we honor Amerigo Vespucci with the name. Now this is called North America, South America, or the or the Americas, based on this map maker. Now we have this big competition happening now because remember I said that the countries back in the day during the Age of Exploration, they were very jealous of each other. And Spain and Portugal, they were the two countries that went ahead and discovered, quote unquote, the Americas. And they started getting to a fight. They had no idea the shape of the continents. They had no idea how to divide it. So they went to the Pope. And the Pope put a line in the middle of the map and said, this is where we're going to divide this new world. And if you take a look at this map, you'll see the papal division line. It just barely cuts a tip of South America. And that little tip of South America was for Portugal. And on the west side of that line, that would belong to Spain. Well, they realized that it wasn't so fair to Spain or to Portugal, so then they later moved that line. A year later, they moved it over a little bit more to the west so it could be more fair to Spain and Portugal. So basically, that means that anything on the right side of or the east side of that line belongs to Portugal, and anything on the west or the left side of that line belongs to Spain. More fair, right? Well, okay, but fair to who? Fair to the Europeans, but what about the Native Americans? Even the name of the explorers that the Spanish used was one of violence. They were called conquistadores, or conquerors. And really, that's what they were there to do. They weren't there to be friendly with the natives. They were there to steal as much gold, conquer as many people, get the glory, and try to convert people from their native religions to the new religion. Most of the Native Americans did not die because of any other reason other than disease. Yes, the Europeans had different weapons, but your Texas history teacher probably talked to you about how it was diseases that killed most of the Native Americans that the Spanish encountered. And those Native Americans that didn't die from disease, well, they would enslave them. So it wasn't a really good, happy story between the Spanish conquerors and the Native Americans. In 1519, they went into my city, Tenochtitlan. Hernan Cortes went there and they conquered the Tlatoani. Tlatoani is the person you see there with the feathers. Tlatoani is the speaker of the people. Well, they conquered him and they went ahead and established a new Spanish rule in a new Spanish city called New Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Spain. We'll talk more about that. Well, actually, we may not talk too much more about that because that was probably something you spoke about with your seventh grade teacher. In 1531, Francisco Pizarro conquered the Peruvian Incas, and there you see a map of the Spanish Empire. And you see that most of South America and North America, most of the middle part, was conquered by Spain. Those two areas of land that are in that aquamarine color, that wasn't part of Spain. In South America, that would later become Brazil. And if you're a soccer fan, you know that Brazilians speak Portuguese. That's because Portugal went ahead and colonized that area. And of course, that North America, we know that North America has a different story that's a little bit separate from Spain, but not entirely separated from Spain. If you take a look at the states of modern day California in North America, modern day California, modern day Florida, and even identify where Texas would be, you'll see that a good chunk of Texas, Florida, New Mexico, and Arizona, they were part of the new Spanish viceroyalty or their the the empire, the Spanish Empire, and later become part of Mexico, which then later became part of North America. So these states have lots of different, has a very, very complicated history when it comes to which countries they've been a part of. And the reason why I pause is because that's where we get this idea of the Six Flags over Texas. Whenever you say Six Flags in modern times, you're talking about that theme park that people go to have fun. Well, the Six Flags comes from the fact that 6 different countries claim Texas as part of their territory. Just a little side history for you. So, yes, the Native Americans and the Europeans didn't have an easy time with each other, but there was something called cultural exchange that happened, where the Spanish and the Native Americans, and all Europeans and Native Americans, they would begin trading ideas in much the same way that different ideas and different things were traded back and forth whenever they went to the Middle East. The same thing happened when they came to the Americas. They would trade metal tools, the Spanish did, horses and cattle, to the Native Americans. The language would actually go both ways. Firearms and sugar, these are things that they would go ahead and be influenced the Native American life and their culture with. The Native Americans back towards the Spanish and other Europeans, they gave them or they exchanged many things with them, like tobacco, potatoes, and tomatoes. Most of the things that we enjoy today as far as food came from the Native American life. There was definitely a blending of cultures too, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. We call this the Columbian Exchange. This back and forth of different foods and different products and even different ideas. Columbian Exchange from Christopher Columbus. Now, not everybody was focused on finding gold and taking it back to Europe. People were focused on making money, but there were different ways of making money. Here you see England, France, and the Dutch, they realized really quickly that there was not much gold in North America. In the north, the more north you went, the less gold there was. So they were still trying to find a way to make money, and one of the ways they thought they could make money was if they found a way to get to India by going north and west. You might be thinking, Mr. Valle, but I thought the people back then thought the world was flat, and they would think that going to the west would be going in the opposite direction of India. That's to the east. Why would they do that if they thought the world was flat? Well, here's a little secret. They knew since forever that the world was actually a globe, that it was a sphere. We teach you in elementary school that the world is flat because that's just a bad tradition. It's a bad habit we teachers have of not telling you that they've always known that the world was round. So they knew that if they would go far enough west, that they would go around the globe and eventually be in the east, next to the Asian continent. These are different explorers that looked for the Northwest Passage. Henry Hudson, Champlain, that is Raleigh, Sir Walter Raleigh, and we'll learn more about him soon. So for the next 200 years, the Spanish, the English, and the French, they would compete for influence and for monetary gain in North America. So let's do a little review. What was the economic system Europeans lived under in which the nobility controlled all of the land? I'll give you 5 seconds for this little review. 5, 4, 3, 2. I'll give you a hint. It begins with the letter F. If you answered feudalism, you are correct. Advances in farming during the High Middle Ages led to an increase in what? Second question reads, advances in farming during the High Middle Ages led to an increase in 5, 4, 3, 2. If you said an increase in population or there were more people, good job. You are correct. Now, the military campaigns that led to increased trade with the Middle East, it was to conquer the Holy Lands in the Middle East. 5, 4, 3, 2. If you called it the Crusades, you are correct. Good job. Let's move on to the next one. The period of advances in arts and sciences that helped fuel the age of exploration is also called the rebirth of science, of arts. It's called the Renaissance, the rebirth. If you go to the Renaissance Fair, you'll actually see lots of people recreating this. And the last one, this was the economic theory practiced by European nations which helped fuel competition to trade. Begins with the letter M. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mercantilism. So guys, today we learned about mercantilism, we learned about the Crusades, we learned about the Columbian Exchange, we learned about cultural exchanges too.